The title is Fearless Heart, Radical Change. Yeah. You need a fearless heart to change radically, and radically change means you'll end up with a much more fearless heart. So we're praying around this image. And I'm going to start with a poem by Naomi Shihab, and it's a very short poem, but it starts us somewhere. On the first day of his life, the baby opens his eyes and gets tired doing even that. He cries when they place a cap on his head, too much, too much. Later, the whole world will touch him and he won't even flinch. What happens to us between that moment of sensitivity when we're young children and then when we become adults and we're hardened up into something? What happens there? What happens in that process? For me, this poem sort of conveys a hardening of a shell of self, yeah, a self-referencing that gets more and more defended, more and more habitualized, more unconscious, until eventually the whole world touches us and we don't even flinch. When I was at art school as a young woman in my foundation year, I had a good friend in the course. And one day I walked into the studio. It was quite a small studio, 25 of us on that course. And she was very quiet that morning when she came in, which made me a bit nervous. And she was quite, she didn't quite look me in the face or something. Something was going on. And then at some point she said to me, could we meet up during the tea break? There's something I want to talk to you about. So I thought, okay, she's going to criticize me. She's going to tell me that she doesn't want to be friends with me. I did this track, okay. And when we met in a private room for this tea break, she told me, last night when I was walking home from art school, I was raped and I've spent the whole night in a police station trying to report what's happened to me. So the opposite was true. Not only was she not cutting me out, she was wanting to include me in a very particular moment in her life. Yeah. And in that moment I cried. But I didn't cry because of her story. I cried because of my own story. I cried because it was a relief that what I thought was going to happen, i.e. being criticised, told me she didn't want to be a friend, I cried because of that. And in a way, you get away with these things, don't you? I got away with it at that point because when somebody tells you that story, they expect someone to cry. So I got away with it then. But all the time, as I've been gradually growing up, I've known there was something wrong about that moment. There was something inadequate in my response. And I knew that it was selfish, but I didn't really understand how it was happening and what was going on. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. The story of my friend didn't touch me. I didn't really flinch, only from a point of view of my own perspective. Compassion isn't a single emotional response. It arises out of a complex of conditions. One of those conditions is to be free at that moment of the story of self. Free at that moment of your own preoccupations with whoever you are. We need to have contact, yes, with ourselves and with others and be fully present there. And being present requires us to get out of the way and be more sort of able to meet the experience straight and squarely. And in meeting that, we need to be free of our own stories and not filtering the experience so strongly through our own conditioning and preoccupations. When we can do that, our response, the action, the word that will come from us will be appropriate and adequate. And later we'll call it compassion. Compassion isn't a philosophical word. It isn't a philosophical action. It's our response to suffering when, for a brief moment, we're not entrenched in our own story of self, in our own preoccupation with self. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about what that means from a Buddhist point of view. I'm going to talk a bit about this term self-clinging or self-grasping. How does it arise? How does it show up in our lives? There's a very familiar quote that a lot of people use. It's a bit of a westernized quote from the Buddhist suttas. I'll just read it to you. The thought manifests as the word. The word manifests as the deed. The deed develops into habit. And habit hardens into character. So watch the thought and its ways with care, and let it spring from love, born out of concern for all beings. I think this gives us some sense of how we're creating self all the time. It's built up gradually, thought by thought, action by action, deed by deed, word by word. A momentum of self and habit encrusting us until it's very hard for the world to touch us. There's some very, very old lines from the Buddhist suttas where the Buddha meets these thoughts, this preoccupation with self. And he says in a very classic way, "House builder, I see you. No longer will you build a house. The rafters are entirely demolished. They've been broken down." It's a great image, the house of self that we create around us, where we take up our lives, where we live all the time, our lives. It's maybe not a pleasant house that we live in, this self that we're creating, but it's a familiar one, and it's very hard to step free of that familiarity. There's a lovely story of that some of you will know about the fisherman's wife or something, the fisher lady's wife, a fisher lady, yeah, fisher lady, and she's gone to market and she's selling a load of fish, okay, and at the end of the market, she misses the last bus home or something, and she has to stay with a friend, and her friend sells flowers. So the friend says, "You can stay in my shop, you can stay in my flower shop and stay overnight." But she cannot sleep. She cannot sleep in that flower shop. The perfume of flowers is too much. She prefers the smell of fish. So she draws the basket over her head and sleeps underneath her fish basket. It's a great image. We get used to our own particular habits, even though they don't smell very good, and we prefer to live there than somewhere different. So thoughts are a natural aspect of the process of the mind. And not all thoughts harden into self-clinging. Some are simply neutral and necessary, like, "I have a train to catch at 6 o'clock this evening." Yeah, that's a fairly neutral thought and it's not going anywhere. Some thoughts lead to greater freedom and to lessening of suffering. So remembering that moment where you chose to help a neighbour put up their tent, and that quality of generosity and what it brought into your life. Just a moment of freedom and ease, of sincerity and of generosity. That's a good thought to have, and that thought leads to freedom. And there are some thoughts that harden into habit and harden us into self. So one of these thoughts, we're having them all the time. You can usually tell when those thoughts are invested in the creation of self, because there's a little bit of heat in them, yeah? And you know when you feel that heat, all of you I'm sure feel that heat, where there's something a bit invested in the outcome. I stepped into the kitchen where I live at the moment, and a couple of friends were there. And one of the women that I lived with said to me, I've just been talking to my friend about when you arrived at Adhisthana, when you arrived at this place. And I've told her it was about 2 years ago. Whew, there was the heat. I said, no, it was 18 months ago. It was 18 months ago. And I felt that charge of self-investment. And I thought, well, what is the problem? You haven't got a mathematical mind, for God's sake, Saddhanandi. What is the problem between 2 years and 18 months? What is that problem? The problem is that if people know I've been there for 2 years, they'll expect more from me. But if you say, well, I've just been there for 18 months, there's a bit more slack in the system, isn't there? Yeah? So I've got a bit more invested in saying, well, actually, it's 18 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days. So there's the charge of self, okay? That we're, at that moment, very quickly, we feel in the system defended and caught up in our own reference point. So thoughts are a part of a conditioned process. They arise in part of a very natural process. So I'll just describe that a bit. So we have contact with the world through our senses. So we have eyes, ear, nose, tongue, body, mind. Yeah? These are familiar words, aren't they? So they're all senses from Buddhist point of view. And through those senses, we experience life, we experience the world. So what? We taste banana, we hear drumming, we see people, we taste coffee, we imagine cheesecake, and we experience the touch of a lover. Okay? And out of that contact arises a quality of sensation. Very simple. It's either pleasant, or it's unpleasant, or it's neutral. Almost everything we experience will fall under that category on that simple level. Banana is pleasant for some people, not very pleasant for some people. Yeah. Heat is pleasant for some people, not so pleasant for some people. So whether you find something pleasant, unpleasant, neutral, makes no difference from an ethical point of view. It's just how we function. And we all have our own preferences, and that's absolutely fine. Unfortunately, we then do something with that experience. So if it's pleasant, chocolate cake for some people, then we want more of it. We want to make sure that our life has it. And we're pretty annoyed when somebody in the queue gets the last piece. Okay. So we've got a kind of reactive process going on here. Out of very simple contact, out of that experience of pleasant, painful, or neutral, we have a reaction, just like a plant moving away from sunlight, moving towards sunlight. We're just reacting, and we're reacting all the time. We're moving away from things that we find unpleasant. We're trying to grab onto something that we find pleasant, and we're just unconscious of everything else that's vaguely neutral. Like the colour of the marquee probably is pretty neutral to all of us. And later, if I was to say to you, what colour's the marquee, you probably couldn't tell me. There's an unconscious level when something's neutral. So this process means that we're being conditioned by a really, really simple mechanism. And we might dress it up in all sorts of sophistications. We might dress it up into all sorts of rationalizations, but basically, a lot of the time, we're in a reactive state, very, very unconscious of the processes that are driving us. So the art is to become more conscious of that. So watch your mind over the next couple of days and see what thoughts arise out of pleasant contact. What thoughts arise out of unpleasant contact? Just noticing that. You could also notice how we have a lot of views around what is pleasant, painful, and neutral, and they may or may not be true. Yeah. So you have an idea that you're somebody who likes whatever it is. I don't know what it is. Give me something you might like. What's that? Oranges. You're somebody who likes oranges. And when you start eating them, you realize you don't like them very much. When you bring awareness to it, you realize you don't like them very much. When I was a very small little girl, I was watching Top of the Pops, which dates me rather strongly, I'm sure. And there was a particular guy singing on Top of the Pops, playing a piano. And I turned to my parents and I said, I don't like this guy. He makes my stomach feel funny. Now I suspect I fancied him. Okay? I expect I'd fallen in love with this guy as a little girl. But the sensations of falling in love are actually not that pleasant. Somewhere along the line, we got trained to believe that was pleasant sensation. But when you're a little girl and you don't have all those views, the romantic ideas and all that sort of stuff, you've just got this weird thing happening in your stomach that you'd rather didn't happen. So we're trying to move from a reactive mind to a creative mind. And that's going to take a lot of awareness. And it's also going to take a lot of a renunciation of views, of attitudes, and of self. It's all those things that we've created self, we've built self out of. I think we don't even realise how strong this kind of cocoon of self is. Yeah? We kind of think, we're just this free agent moving around the world and we're having experience and we're just doing something kind of interesting with that. But it's not like that at all. We're just totally conditioned. And we're trying to create a little bit of a gap in that conditioning process. I was once told by a friend that when they'd been on a very long retreat, that part of being on the retreat, at some point in that retreat, they were asked to exchange their name with somebody else's on the retreat. So everybody put their name into a hat, and then you pulled out a name, and you became that person for a day. Okay? So you went to that person and you said, hiya, I'm going to be you for the rest of the day. Can you tell me what you do? Can you just tell me what you do in the day, and then I'm going to get up in the morning tomorrow and I'm going to be you for a day. So they describe what it is. They describe how they live their life. They describe how they live their day. And the friend that was telling me about this, they could be quite low in energy, kind of a bit depressive, a bit sort of inert in a way, and they suffered from quite a lot of headaches. Anyway, they pulled a name out of a hat, and the name of the person that came out was quite a dynamic, energetic person. So they said, okay, I've got to be them for a day. Here we go. So they got up, they did the yoga that the person always did, they ate the muesli that the person always did, and then they walked around, then they meditated, then they studied something. So they had a day as if they were that person. They had a great day. They had a great day. That was a good lesson. But what was an even stronger lesson was that person that was being them all day had a headache all day. Who are we? Who are we in that process, really? What are we made of, really? We need to create a life for ourselves that support us to become less selfish, less preoccupied with self, more creative, more expansive, more porous to the world, so the world can touch us. So I've been just thinking a few ideas, a few ways that happens. It's just my take on the world. It's going to be different for all of you. I'm just going to mention a few things. Practice cooperation. Engage with a sense of service to the world through vocational work. Develop a strong vision for your life. Develop authentic friendships and understand the nature of mind. A small list. So I'll say a few things about each one. Cooperation. I think so much of our lives now is, we often live and work in quite an isolated way. Our families are smaller, and a lot of the work we do is actually, rather than being in teams, it's often on computers where we're sitting a lot of the time on our own. There's a whole kind of society that's being created around us based on isolation and insulation. We rarely have to cooperate with other people. I don't know if any of you have been involved with setting up this festival. Have any of you been involved in that? Some of you, yeah. So I suspect you've had to cooperate at some point in that. What does that mean? It means you have to be willing to get into dialogue about views and ideas that you have about how things should be. We've got to put a marquee up, and I think we should do it this way. But somebody else thinks it should be done a different way. And their view is that they're right. But you thought you were right. But we need to get into dialogue, and we need to then cooperate with each other. We can't just assert ourselves in that situation and just act from the power mode and just may the biggest person win kind of thing. We're going to have to get into communication and talk about what we need to do. And that challenges a lot of our views and our self-defensiveness. Raising children with a partner, I expect that requires a bit of cooperation. I've never done it myself, but I'm sure those of you that have raised children in a family, you realise there are different methods to bring up children, and it requires conversations about it. So through this process of living, working with other people, we're modified. Our psyche, our ego, our habits are modified and matured. We're softened. Yeah, we're softened. I think Pema Chodron uses this lovely image of being cooked well. It's like these situations cook us soft until we're soft. And then we're more flexible. We've got more ease around us in the world. Yeah. We're more able to respond to the world. So often we don't allow ourselves to be cooked very thoroughly. We put ourselves in a situation, turn the heat up, we boil away for a few minutes, then we switch it off. And we expect lunch to be still ready later. No. You've got to cook thoroughly. What process do you need to engage with to cook yourself thoroughly? To gradually modify and engage that self-clinging with an intensity that will loosen it all off and make you change your mind. Like I said earlier, I've lived in communities for 33 years now, and it's a great life, and even washing up can be complex. Different people have different methods. Knowing which way the knife should be when it's drying, I mean, there's good reasons, isn't there? Some people like to have the knife facing upwards because then it's more hygienic, the blade facing upwards. Some people like to face the blade down because it's safer. Yeah, it kind of makes sense when you know, but boy, can that, these details are where the self arises strongly. Okay, then there's this quality of service. Just giving yourself to a project that shares your values, takes them further. I mean, that project can be can be a value like kindness or clarity. You could just put yourself into that service. Put yourself in service of creating sangha, creating community, acting kindly, or you can put yourself into the service of an actual project, like creating a Buddhafield festival is a big project. And when you do this, when you're in service to a project, your reference point is different from when you're just serving yourself. And you see when you're serving yourself and when you're serving the project. It's a good question to ask yourself. What am I serving right now in this action? And service isn't just something that you do, it's an attitude to life. It's a way of being in the world that is drawing on resources that you have in yourself and is willing to give them as a contribution to the world around you. So that can be your time, your energy, your talents, whatever. Just giving those qualities, giving those talents over into the world, and allowing them to be of service to others, allowing them to contribute to your own life and to others' lives. There's this very lovely poem by Naomi Shihab called Famous, and I'm just going to read the last couple of verses. I don't know if people know it. It's quite a cheeky poem in some ways. So the last couple of verses say this. I want to be famous to shuffling men who smile while crossing streets, sticky children in grocery lines, famous as the one who smiled back. I want to be famous in the way a pulley is famous, or a buttonhole, not because it did anything spectacular, but because it never forgot what it could do. Never forget what you can do and just offer it to the world. Develop a strong vision for yourself and also for the world, based on personal values. So just notice for yourself, what is it you respond to around you? Is it that quality of beauty? Is it a kind action between one person and another? Is it just simply the way a person is? What do you respond to? When you begin to realise what you're responding to, you're beginning to unpack and understand what your personal vision is going to be for your life. When I was in my 20s, I went on a number of solitary retreats where I was on my own on retreat for 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, different lengths of time. And at some point I asked myself, while I was obviously struggling with whatever, meditation and, well, just being with me, basically. I was struggling with that. And I thought, why am I doing this? Why am I doing this? And I thought, why am I even involved in Buddhism? It's like crazy. I'm an extrovert, for goodness sake. Why do I have to meditate? You know, what is this meditation thing? Why am I on retreat for 3 weeks on my own, for goodness? It's not like me at all. Why am I doing this? And I thought, well, the people that do this, I do find very attractive. They've got something about them. I thought, for goodness sake, that's just got too many people in it. How can that possibly be of value? These kind of conversations we all have, I'm sure. And then I thought, okay, so I tried it again. Why am I doing this? And I said, well, I think it might make it might help me become the person I want to be. No, that's just too, you're just too concentrated on, I don't know, what other people think of you. Anyway, I'm quite relentless sometimes. So so I tried it again, and the answer was this. This is the only thing that gives my life meaning. Yeah. And in that moment, I felt as if I'd heard a voice I'd never heard before. I'd heard my deepest values, where I thought, my life needs to have meaning. And changing, transforming my mind and helping others do the same is what gives my life meaning. If I don't have a life of meaning, I don't know how I'm going to get up in the morning. I don't know how people get up in the morning, to be honest. And I realised this motivation was totally pure in me. It hadn't got anybody else's hands on it. Do you see what I mean? I hadn't learnt it from somewhere. This was mine. Many, many years later, when my grandmother died, a very straightforward death at the age of 94, I had a bit of a kind of, I had a strong experience of being in a very dark, black room. And there were no doors and there were no windows. And I was trying to describe to people, I'm in a dark room and there are no doors and there are no windows. And they said, oh, maybe it's your nihilism. You're quite nihilistic. Maybe it's your nihilism. And I thought, well, maybe this is nihilism. And then the answer came to me, this is a life without faith. This is a life without meaning. A dark room where there's no door and there's no window. And all I'm trying to do is keep the door open slightly for me and for others. That's what gives my life meaning. So look at your experience and learn what gives your life meaning. What values do you relate to? Learn to hold a big, pure vision for you and this world. And then serve it in your life. Serve that vision in your life. Okay, friendship. Authentic friendship. I'm sure a lot of us here have a lot of friends, but communicating authentically takes a bit of practice. We don't do it naturally. I remember years ago describing something to one of my friends and realizing I was speaking without self-censoring, possibly for the first time in my life. Create friendships in your life where you can speak your deepest truths, your deepest fears, so you can confess actions that you feel ashamed of. You can share yourself with. This will draw out a deep honesty from ourselves and the other person. It's not easy to do. Once you've started, it'll be hard to live without it. When I was offered the job of being chair at Taraloka, this women's retreat centre that Singer Matti mentioned, I had a good friend who I knew would be a bit envious of that job because it is a gorgeous job. And I was a bit reluctant to tell her, but I knew I had to tell her. So I told her badly. This is what we do, don't we? And I was nonchalant. I said, guess what, I've been offered a job and it's chair of Taraloka and I'm sure it doesn't matter, but anyway. And she responded in the way that sort of thing does get, a sort of slightly annoyed, irritated response back. And the next day, because she's a very good friend, the next day she called me and she said, I'm sorry, I reacted to you. It was just, I found it very painful the way you told me that news. And I said, I'm sorry, because I was worried about how you would receive that news, I did it badly. It was 8:30 in the morning when we had that conversation. She said, that's fantastic. And I said, see you later. And she said, yes. And that was the end of that conversation. That was a friendship that had been developed over a long period of time. That quality of ease and a willingness to speak the truth. So what stops us from developing authentic friendships? Our nervousness around the self, our preoccupation with the self. Can you relax it? And can you also gather around you people that will help you do that work? Interestingly enough, I think I developed stronger friendships through going on solitary retreats. You wouldn't have imagined it. You go away on your own and you just meditate and study the Dharma and you're on your own. And for some reason you develop strong friendships out of that. Why is that? That's because you begin to learn about yourself. And in learning about ourselves, we can come into relationship with other. Okay, finally, understand the nature of mind. Just like that. Just understand the nature of mind. There is thought. There are conditions arising that lead to thought. And then there's the knowing that we have thoughts. There's the recognizing that we have a thought, and that is very different. As soon as we know that, what we know is that thought is just a thought. Mental states are just mental states. Emotions are just emotions. And they do not have to drive the whole system in an unconscious way. When I was travelling to Bristol one day and I stopped off I changed trains in Newport Station, which was full of Cardiff footballers at the time. And I loved them, actually. I loved being around them all. And just loved all the people that I was seeing in the station. And I thought, there's a difference between me and these people. What is the difference? And I thought, the difference is, I know contact, out of contact arises thoughts. And out of thoughts arises a whole chain of reactions. And because I know that, I'm slightly freer. So just see the nature of mind, see where the processes are arising in your mind, and don't over-identify with them, don't over-invest in them. Can you be freer, have a bigger mind than that? Begin to recognize how the thoughts are driven by habits, driven by views, and then choose which one to follow. So what is compassion out of all of this? It's not a mental state that can develop on top of self-obsession. It's not something extra that we can add on to the mix. It arises when you have stepped out of the way. Yeah. It's a moment of freedom from living in the shell of self. So if our lives are more turned towards that vision of compassion and selflessness, then our ability to respond to others and to suffering specifically will begin to emerge more appropriately. We'll benefit ourselves and we'll benefit others. And every action that comes from that quality free of self-clinging will have an impact in the world. Who knows what impact that'll have in the world? I'm just going to finish with a story that I heard on the British radio about 4 years ago. It was when there was that massive avalanche in Nepal, or Kathmandu, I think it was Nepal, wasn't it? About 4 years ago. And there were a lot of people trekking in the mountains at that time and a lot of climbers up there. And there was quite a few deaths, quite a few people were lost in that avalanche. It was a very sudden avalanche. And I was listening to the news on the radio the next morning, and they were interviewing a guy that managed to come out of the mountain. And I'll tell you the story as I heard it. So he was a young man, and he'd been climbing the mountains, and suddenly the avalanche had happened. So he said, you lose vision when there's that amount of snow around. Everything goes white. You cannot see anything. And for a short while, you have no idea what's up and what's down. You have no idea where your bearings are. You can hardly see more than 3 feet ahead of you. The whole air is full of snow. And you know, because you can't see anything, it's very, very dangerous. And because you've lost your bearings, you don't even know which way to turn. But I had an instinct, and I turned in this direction and I started making my way meter by meter. And after a while, I met a couple of women, and they were slightly hysterical and crying, and they're saying, we're going to die, we know we're going to die, we're never going to leave the mountain. And he said, just follow me, let's just keep moving forward. There is a possibility we're going to die, but let's just keep moving forward. So those 2 women joined him, and they carried moving forward, meter by meter. And then they met another little group of people, and they said, we don't know what's happening, we've already lost 1 person, we don't know which way to go. And he said, I think we need to go this way, follow us. And if anybody loses contact with the person ahead of you, shout and we'll all stop. And then they moved forward. And he said, we continued. And gradually, as we continued throughout the mountain, that small band of people began to find the posts in the ground which marked the last bit of the path, yeah? So he knew at that point they were on safe territory. And at that moment, he turned round, and there was 100 people following him, meter by meter. He'd only spoken to the first few, but the few behind him had spoken to somebody else behind them, and somebody else behind them had spoken to somebody else behind them. He was a conditioning factor in those bunch of people coming out, although he personally hadn't had contact with every single one of them. And you listened on the radio to his moment where he realized what he'd done. Just by that moment of courage where he just got out of the way and said to the first bunch of people, let's do it this way. Okay, we can do it inch by inch, meter by meter. Every action, who knows what effect it'll have. Thank you.